Michael Carter had always taken refuge in the solitude of his home, tucked away at the end of a quiet street, a sanctuary where the world could be kept at bay. But that afternoon, his peace was violently shattered. Through the window, he spotted a furious woman in a garish green tracksuit barking into her phone as she stood defiantly in his driveway. Nearby, an ominous tow truck idled, its driver caught in a palpable air of uncertainty as chaos began to unfold. Michael's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he recognized the target of the impending tow, his cherished 1972 Chevrolet Chevelle, a masterpiece he had painstakingly restored over years. The sight of a stranger daring to seize his prized possession unleashed a surge of raw, unbridled anger. At first, he clung to the hope that this was merely a misunderstanding, a mistake perhaps, but as he strode outside to confront the intruder, her smug stance and crossed arms revealed a chilling confidence, as though she ruled his domain. There was no error here. "Stop right there!" Michael roared, his voice low and seething with barely contained fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The woman pivoted towards him, her face shifting from unreadable to slicing amusement. "Ah, there you are," she drawled, as if he were the interloper. "This car is parked illegally, and I'm having it removed." Michael's jaw clenched, his eyes burning as he fixed them on his car, parked squarely in his own driveway, not obstructing a soul. "Illegally?" he spat, incredulity mixing with rage. "This is my driveway, and that's my car," she scoffed, rolling her eyes as though dismissing a naive child's ramblings. "Actually, this is a shared driveway," she declared coolly, gesturing at the concrete path like a decree. "And your car is blatantly violating HOA regulations." Fury boiled inside Michael as he stared at her, the weight of years spent securing his rightful claim to the property, and the meticulous restoration of his car blazing in his veins. His driveway was private, legally his, and the HOA had no jurisdiction here. He had verified every detail before ever settling in. "Listen, I don't care who you claim to be or which bogus rules you're quoting," Michael thundered, taking a deep, steadying breath against the storm of anger. "You have absolutely no right to tow someone's car from private property just because you feel like it." "Oh, but I do," she snapped, arms rigid and unyielding. "Besides, you're a menace to the entire neighborhood. That rickety, noisy car of yours is an eyesore, and we're trying to uphold some semblance of decency around here." Michael's blood roared with indignation. It wasn't merely her ludicrous claim, but the sheer nerve she displayed in wielding unwarranted authority over his life. "This car is none of your business," he growled, his voice a low, dangerous warning. "I suggest you back off before I call the cops." A sharp, mocking laugh burst from her lips, slicing through the tension like shattered glass. "Oh, go ahead and call them," she mocked. "I'd love to explain to the cops how your precious car is violating HOA rules." Then, turning to the tow truck driver, Michael's glare intensified. "And you," he said, fixing the driver with a steely look, "you know full well towing a car without the owner's consent, especially on private property, is illegal." The driver shifted uncomfortably, caught in a crossfire of authority and defiance. "Look, lady," he muttered weakly, "I don't want any trouble here. Are you really sure this is okay?" "It's more than okay," she snapped icily, her tone sharp enough to cut steel. "I've already got the HOA president on board. Just do your job." Michael inhaled deeply, channeling every ounce of his mounting wrath as he stepped directly between her and his treasured Chevelle. "The HOA has zero authority here," he declared, his voice unyielding. "If you so much as touch this vehicle, you'll regret it." For a suspended, heart-stopping moment, time itself seemed to still. The woman's smirk faltered, betraying a flash of frustration, perhaps even doubt, as she realized Michael wasn't one to be intimidated. Then, with venom dripping from every syllable, she jabbed a finger at him. "You'll regret this," she hissed. With that, she spun on her heel and stomped away toward the street, leaving behind a tension that practically crackled in the air. The tow truck driver, visibly relieved to escape the confrontation, mumbled an apology as he trailed after her. Michael stood firm, his heart pounding like a war drum, watching as they drove off into the uncertain distance. Despite a fleeting calm, he knew this battle was far from over. The war for his sanctuary had only just begun. The uneasy calm didn't last long. The next morning, Michael woke up to find a note taped to his front door. It was printed on official-looking HOA letterhead, but something about it felt off. The wording was vague, almost as if whoever wrote it was trying to sound professional but didn't quite know how. This is your last warning to remove the unapproved vehicle from the driveway. Failure to comply will result in further action being taken. No signature, no contact number, just the HOA logo slapped at the top like it had been copied and pasted from a Google search. Michael let out a bitter chuckle as he read it. The HOA had no jurisdiction here. His property wasn't even part of their neighborhood. This was clearly another stunt from Tracksuit Nancy, as he had started calling her in his head. Instead of intimidation, the note only strengthened his resolve. He wasn't about to be bullied out of his own rights. That afternoon, he noticed her again. Nancy, standing across the street, arms folded, her gaze locked on his driveway. She wasn't even trying to be subtle. Every time he stepped outside, he could feel her watching him, her piercing stare following him like a hawk tracking its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. Michael had dealt with nosy neighbors before, but this was something else. This woman was obsessed. He needed proof. That evening, he installed a security camera above his garage, angling it to get a clear view of the driveway. He had a feeling that this wouldn't be the last time she tried something, and he was right. The next morning, another note. This time, it was stuck to his windshield. Notice of violation. Your vehicle is in non-compliance with community standards. A fine of $500 will be imposed if it is not removed within 48 hours. Michael shook his head, torn between amusement and disbelief. She was really trying to push this HOA angle, despite having no actual authority. As the days passed, the harassment continued. Nancy kept her vigil, always lurking, always watching. Then came the staged complaints. First, a call to the city claiming Michael's car was abandoned. An inspector arrived, looked at the pristine, obviously functioning vehicle, and rolled his eyes before leaving. Then another call, this time to noise control, saying his car was disturbing the peace. Michael hadn't even driven it in 2 days. It was almost funny how desperate she was. Almost. One evening, just as he was about to head to bed, a faint noise from outside caught his attention. A soft clink, like metal tapping against metal. Michael's stomach twisted. Grabbing his phone, he crept toward the window and peered outside. His breath caught as he saw her. Nancy, crouched by his car, a pair of bolt cutters in her hands. Adrenaline surged through him. Throwing open the front door, he stormed outside. "Hey!" he barked. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Nancy jumped to her feet, startled, the bolt cutters dangling in her hands like a smoking gun. "Oh," she said, feigning innocence. "I was just checking something." "Checking what?" Michael folded his arms. "Making sure my car isn't leaking oil all over the driveway," she said smoothly, regaining her composure. Michael narrowed his eyes. "You were trying to cut the lock on my wheel clamp." Her eyes flickered with something, anger, annoyance, maybe even embarrassment. But then, like flipping a switch, she straightened up and crossed her arms. "Go ahead," she said smugly. "Call the police. I'd love to see what they have to say about your illegal modifications." Michael's jaw clenched. "Illegal? Lady, you don't even know the law." "I know enough," she shot back. "And I know the HOA rules are against these kinds of vehicles." Michael took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "This is not an HOA property. You have zero authority here." She didn't respond to that, but instead of backing down, she just sneered at him. "We'll see about that," she said before storming off into the night. Michael stood there, heart pounding, watching her retreat. He had a sinking feeling this was just the beginning. Michael woke up the next morning expecting to feel some sort of relief. He had caught Nancy red-handed with the bolt cutters. Surely after being confronted she would back off. He was wrong. As soon as he stepped outside, his heart plummeted. His beloved 1972 Chevrolet Chevelle, the car he had spent years restoring, pouring his blood, sweat, and soul into, was vandalized. Deep, jagged scratches ran along the driver's side door, the kind of scratches that didn't happen by accident. the kind that someone deliberately carved in with pure spiteful intent. Michael's hands clenched into fists. He didn't need to guess who had done this. His jaw tightened as he stormed back inside and pulled up the security footage from the night before. His stomach churned as he fast-forwarded through the timeline. Then there she was, Nancy, wearing the same damn green tracksuit, sneaking onto his driveway under the cover of darkness. In the grainy footage, he saw her pull something from her pocket. Keys. Then, with a look of pure malice on her face, she dragged them across his car's pristine paint over and again. Michael felt his blood pressure spike. He immediately called the police. When an officer arrived, Michael wasted no time. "I have everything on camera," he said, leading him to the footage. The officer watched in silence as the video played. When it ended, he let out a slow breath and jotted something down in his notebook. "Well," he said, "that's pretty damning." Michael crossed his arms. "So what now?" "We'll file a report and look into it," the officer said. "She'll probably deny it, but with footage like this, we have a solid case. I'd advise you to keep your car covered or in a garage if possible. She's willing to key it once. She might try something worse." Michael's stomach twisted. He didn't have a garage, just a driveway. The officer left, promising to follow up, but Michael knew better than to expect immediate action. He had just declared war on Nancy, and she wouldn't take it lying down. Less than 24 hours later, a new letter arrived. It was another HOA violation notice. Penalty notice, immediate action required. You have been issued a fine of $500 for continued violation of neighborhood aesthetic standards. If the vehicle is not removed within 48 hours, further action will be taken. Michael let out a humorless laugh. She was doubling down. His mind raced. Did she have actual connections to the HOA, or was she just making these letters up? Not wanting to leave anything to chance, he drafted a formal appeal, attaching legal documents proving that his driveway was not under HOA jurisdiction. He even included his property survey and city zoning records. Then he mailed it directly to the HOA board with a strongly worded message. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to formally dispute the violation notices I have received regarding my vehicle. As per the enclosed legal documents, my property is not under the jurisdiction of the HOA. Any further attempts to harass me with fabricated violations will be met with legal action. If you have any questions, I suggest you consult an actual attorney before sending fraudulent fines to a property you do not control." Satisfied, he mailed it off. But Nancy wasn't done yet. That night, Michael spotted her pacing across the street, talking on her phone, lips moving fast, her free hand gesturing wildly. She was frustrated, angry, probably fuming over the fact that her fake fines weren't working. Michael was prepared for petty games. What he wasn't prepared for was how far she was willing to go next. The next afternoon, Michael ran out for groceries. He was gone for less than an hour. When he pulled back into his street, his stomach dropped. A tow truck was in his driveway again. This time, the driver had already hooked up his Chevelle, the chains wrapped around the front wheels, preparing to haul it away. Michael slammed his foot on the gas and skidded into the driveway, throwing his car into park so fast he nearly tore the gear shift off. He jumped out. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared. The tow truck driver looked up, startled. Nancy stepped forward, arms crossed, smiling like a cat who had just caught a mouse. "Oh, Michael," she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "I tried to warn you, but since you refused to comply, the HOA had to take action." Michael strode up to the driver. "This is private property," he barked. "If you so much as move this truck an inch, you're looking at a grand theft auto charge." The driver hesitated, glancing between Michael and Nancy. "She said it was an HOA order," he muttered. "It's not," Michael said sharply. "And if you check the registration, you'll see my name is on that car." The driver pulled out his clipboard, flipping through the paperwork. His frown deepened. "Wait a second. This isn't a valid tow order." Nancy's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. "I got approval from the HOA president." Michael took a step closer. "You mean the same HOA that doesn't own this property?" Nancy's face turned red. Michael turned back to the tow truck driver. "You might want to unhook my car before I call the police." The driver didn't need to be told twice. He started lowering the vehicle immediately. Nancy was fuming. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You don't belong here. That car doesn't belong here." Michael smirked. "Then why is it my name on the title and not yours?" Nancy opened her mouth, then snapped it shut with a frustrated growl. She stormed away, her green tracksuit flashing in the sun as she disappeared down the street. Michael stood there watching her go, his heart still pounding. He had won this round, but something in his gut told him this fight was far from over. Michael barely had time to enjoy his victory before the war escalated yet again. The next morning, he stepped outside, coffee in hand, ready to take a deep breath of the crisp morning air. But the moment he set foot on his driveway, his stomach twisted into a knot. His Chevelle was wrecked. The windshield was shattered, spiderwebbed from an impact so forceful it had nearly caved in. The side mirrors were smashed off, leaving jagged shards behind. Scratches marred the entire length of the car, crude X marks gouged deep into the paint. It wasn't just vandalism, it was rage. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears as he set his coffee down on the hood of his truck and stormed back inside. His fingers trembled as he pulled up the security footage, scrubbing through the night's recording, his jaw tightening as the screen flickered. Then there it was, Nancy. This time she hadn't come alone. Two men in dark clothing stood beside her in the dim glow of a street lamp. One held a crowbar, the other a bat. Michael watched in disbelief as they went to work. The man with the crowbar swung first, shattering the windshield in one brutal hit. The other took out the side mirrors, knocking them clean off. Nancy, standing behind them, egged them on, pointing at the car with visible glee. Then, as if this weren't enough, she stepped forward, pulled something from her pocket, and began dragging it across the car's body, carving deep scratches into the doors. Michael froze the frame. A box cutter. His hands curled into fists. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was malicious destruction of property. This was a crime, and this time, she wasn't getting away with it. The police got involved. Michael called the police immediately. Within 20 minutes, a squad car pulled up and two officers stepped out. He wasted no time leading them to his laptop, playing the footage in grim silence. As the video ended, one of the officers, a no-nonsense guy with a buzz cut, let out a low whistle. "Damn," he muttered. "She really went all out." Michael folded his arms. "So what happens now?" "We'll open a case for vandalism and trespassing," the officer said, jotting down notes. "This footage is solid evidence, and considering the level of damage, she could be looking at felony charges." Michael exhaled sharply. Good. But he knew Nancy, and he knew she wasn't going to accept defeat quietly. Nancy's fake defense didn't take long to crumble. A few hours later, as Michael was on the phone with his insurance company, there was a sharp knock at his door. He opened it to find Nancy standing there, arms crossed, a sickly sweet smile plastered on her face. "Michael," she said, tilting her head, "I heard you called the police on me. That's a bit extreme, don't you think?" Michael's jaw tightened. "You're lucky that's all I did. Now, unless you want to add harassment to your list of charges, I suggest you leave." Nancy's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "You think you've won, don't you? But this isn't over, Michael. Not by a long shot." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing in his doorway, a sinking feeling in his stomach. He knew she was right. This was far from over, but he also knew something else. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. Michael stared at her, his expression blank. "You destroyed my car," he said. Nancy let out a laugh, light and airy, as if she hadn't just committed a felony. "Oh, please. You can't prove it was me." Michael smiled coldly. "Actually, I can." He held up his phone, tapping the screen. Paused security footage flickered to life, showing her standing beside the two men as they demolished his car. Nancy's smirk wavered. "That's not me," she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. Michael arched an eyebrow. "You're literally wearing the same tracksuit." He glanced down at herself, the bright green tracksuit giving her away. Her jaw clenched. Michael leaned against the doorframe. "You're done, Nancy." She huffed, then turned on her heel. "This isn't over," she snapped, storming off. Michael smirked. "Oh yes, it is." Just when he thought the nightmare was over, A certified letter arrived in the mail the next day. It was from the HOA. Notice of immediate action required due to ongoing violations, including unauthorized vehicles, disturbances, and improper property maintenance. You are hereby issued a fine of $1,000. Failure to comply will result in legal escalation. Michael burst out laughing. They were really desperate now. He grabbed his phone and called the HOA office directly. A woman answered, "Hello, this is Linda with the Homeowners Association. How may I?" "Yeah, hi Linda. I just got a bogus fine in the mail for property you don't own. Care to explain?" There was a pause. "Sir, if there's been an error..." "Oh no, don't try to play this off. I want to know who authorized this." Silence. Then finally, "Nancy brought it to our attention." Michael's laugh was pure disbelief. "Of course she did. Well, Linda, let me make this easy for you. Nancy is currently under police investigation for vandalizing my car. If you want to be dragged into this with her, be my guest. Otherwise, I suggest you rip that fine in half and never send me anything again." A longer silence, then a quiet, "We'll review the matter internally." Michael hung up, grinning. A few hours later, he received an email from the HOA board stating that the fine had been rescinded due to a misunderstanding. Nancy's last desperate move. Michael had won every battle so far, but he had underestimated just how far Nancy was willing to go. That night, he was jolted awake by the blaring of his car alarm. His heart pounded as he grabbed his phone and opened the security feed. What he saw made his blood run cold. Nancy was back, and this time she wasn't alone. Two men stood beside her, the same ones from before, but this time they weren't holding crowbars. They were holding gasoline cans. Michael's stomach dropped. They weren't just here to damage the car, they were here to burn it. His fingers flew to 911, his voice sharp and urgent. "I need police now. I have intruders on my property trying to set my car on fire." The dispatcher assured him officers were on the way, but Michael didn't have time to wait. He hit the floodlights, the entire driveway lighting up like daylight, revealing Nancy and her two accomplices. Mid-action, one of the men froze, gas can in hand. The other stumbled backward, eyes wide. Nancy, however, stood her ground, her face twisting into pure hatred. "Do it," she snapped. "Just light it." Sirens wailed as police cars screeched into the driveway, their lights flashing. The two men bolted, but Nancy wasn't fast enough. Two officers tackled her face first into the pavement. Michael stepped outside, arms crossed, watching as they cuffed her. The lead officer glanced at him. "You pressing charges?" Michael grinned. "Oh, you bet I am." Nancy thrashed in the officer's grip, screaming about how the neighborhood was better off without him. Michael just smiled as they hauled her into the squad car. Finally, it was over. Michael stood on his front porch, arms crossed, watching the flashing red and blue lights as the police car carrying Nancy disappeared down the street. His heart was still pounding, an adrenaline surge coursing through his veins. She was finally getting what she deserved, but he knew better than to assume it was over. Nancy had spent weeks terrorizing him, harassing him, vandalizing his property, and now attempting arson. She had taken this war to a level he hadn't expected, and even with her in custody, Michael suspected she had one last card to play. So, he decided it was time to rally the neighborhood. If she had been bold enough to target him, she had probably done the same to others. It was time to find out just how deep her corruption ran. The neighborhood speaks out. Michael started with his next-door neighbor, Tom, an older man who had lived on the street for over 2 decades. If anyone knew the history of Nancy's reign of terror, it was him. The moment Tom opened the door and saw Michael, he let out a knowing sigh. "Nancy?" he asked. Michael smirked. "She finally got arrested." Tom's eyebrows shot up. "Seriously?" Michael nodded. "She and 2 guys tried to set my car on fire." Tom whistled. "You know, I always knew she was crazy, but arson? That's a new one." Michael leaned against the doorframe. "You've had problems with her too, haven't you?" Tom scoffed. "Who hasn't?" As it turned out, Nancy had a long history of harassment in the neighborhood. Tom wasn't the first, and Michael certainly wasn't the last. She had reported a veteran couple down the street for having an unauthorized flag on their porch, an American flag. She had tried to get a single mother fined for letting her kids play outside, citing excessive noise. She had faked HOA violations for at least 3 other households, including one elderly woman who had actually paid the bogus fines out of fear. And worst of all, she had done it all under the guise of the HOA, despite the fact that she wasn't even on the board. Michael's stomach twisted. She had built a fake empire of control, and the neighborhood had let her do it out of fear. Well, not anymore. Gathering the evidence. Michael spent the next 2 days knocking on doors, listening to story after story about Nancy's harassment. People were eager to talk. In fact, some of them had been waiting for years to see someone finally stand up to her. One woman, Rebecca, actually started crying when she found out Nancy had been arrested. "She tried to get my husband fired," she admitted, her voice shaking. "She sent fake complaints to his company saying he was harassing neighbors. We almost lost everything." Michael's hands curled into fists. Nancy hadn't just been a nuisance. She had been a genuine threat to the people around her. By the end of the second day, Michael had a thick folder full of witness statements, screenshots, and HOA dispute records that proved just how much damage Nancy had done. And then he made his next move, exposing Nancy to the HOA. Michael didn't just send the file to the HOA, he walked it in person. When he arrived at the HOA office, the receptionist looked nervous. She recognized him after all. Nancy had tried to fine him repeatedly. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge," Michael said, dropping the folder on the counter. Within minutes, he was led into a conference room where 3 members of the HOA board sat waiting. The president, a man in his 50s with graying hair, folded his hands. "Mr. Carter, I assume this is about recent events?" Michael leaned forward. "You could say that." Then he laid it all out. The fake violations, false HOA letters, the bogus fines. He showed them video evidence of Nancy vandalizing his car and the police report detailing her attempted arson. The board members looked mortified. "We had no idea she was doing this," one of them said. "She's not even on the board." Michael smirked. "Yeah, no kidding." The president exhaled sharply. "Mr. Carter, on behalf of the HOA, I'd like to formally apologize. We will be issuing a public statement clarifying that Nancy acted without any authorization from us." Michael nodded. "That's a good start," he said, "but you need to go further." He slid the folder across the table. "You need to start undoing the damage she's done. Refund the people she scammed with fake fines. Reach out to the people she falsely reported and make it right. If you don't, I'll take this whole damn story to the local news." The president's expression hardened, but not in anger, in understanding. "We'll take care of it," he promised, Nancy's last play and her final downfall. The HOA acted quickly, issuing a formal statement to the neighborhood and even holding an emergency meeting to address complaints. Neighbors were furious. Nancy had abused their trust for years, and now that the truth was out, people wanted justice. But Michael knew Nancy wasn't going to go down quietly, and sure enough, just as he was starting to think she had finally accepted defeat, she struck again, this time from behind bars. Michael received an email from the HOA a week later. Nancy was trying to sue him. The claim? Defamation. Michael laughed out loud when he read it. This woman had keyed his car, tried to burn it, harassed half the neighborhood, and now she had the audacity to say he was ruining her reputation. Oh, this was going to be fun, was going to. Connecting the dots at the police station. The truth finally came out. The 2 men, Jason and Eric, weren't just random thugs. They were Nancy's nephews. She had been calling them from jail, feeding them orders, telling them to keep up the fight while she was locked up. They had been the ones behind the slashed tires, the mailbox stuffing, the spray paint. Nancy was still pulling the strings, but now the police had proof: tampering with a witness, conspiracy to commit arson, destruction of property, criminal harassment. And with those charges, Nancy wasn't just looking at 6 months anymore. She was looking at years behind bars, the final blow. A week later, Michael received a letter from the district attorney's office. Nancy had pleaded guilty. Her nephews had flipped on her, exposing the entire plan in exchange for reduced sentences. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison. No parole, no appeals, no more threats. Michael stared at the letter for a long time, then with a satisfied grin, he tore it in half and tossed it in the trash. It was over, for real this time. Peace, at last. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. The HOA formally removed Nancy from their community records, issuing another public statement condemning her actions. Neighbors who had lived in fear of retaliation were now hosting barbecues, letting their kids play outside, painting their homes whatever color they damn well pleased. Michael, meanwhile, spent the next few weeks restoring his Chevelle, buffing out the damage, repainting the panels, making it better than ever. One evening, as he leaned against the hood, beer in hand, Tom walked over, shaking his head with a grin. "You know," he said, "I've lived here a long time, seen a lot of crazy things, but this—" Michael chuckled. "Let me guess, worst HOA horror story you've ever seen." Tom took a sip of his drink. "Let's just say if you ever write a book about it, I'd buy a copy." Michael smirked, raising his beer in a mock toast. "Here's to living drama-free from now on." And for the first time in months, he truly believed it. Michael sat on his porch, the night air crisp and cool, as he watched the street in front of his house. It was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in months, no one was watching him, trying to tow his car, sneaking onto his property with bolt cutters, spray paint, or gasoline cans. Nancy was gone, and her reign of terror had finally ended. But the shockwaves of her downfall were still rippling through the neighborhood. The morning after Nancy's final arrest, Michael woke up to something unexpected. A crowd had gathered outside his house. Neighbors, people who had once kept their heads down and avoided confrontation, were standing on the sidewalk, talking, pointing at his driveway, murmuring among themselves. As Michael stepped outside, a woman named Rebecca, who lived a few houses down, approached him. "You actually did it," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "She's gone." Michael shrugged. "Took long enough." Another man, Mark, stepped forward. "You have no idea how many of us wanted to do what you did." Michael leaned against the doorframe. "Well, it's over now. Let's make sure it stays that way." "She admitted she's been harassing people for years," Rebecca said, "but we didn't think we could fight back. We thought she'd always win." Michael let out a slow breath. He had known Nancy was bad, but hearing just how deep her influence went made his stomach turn. "She had all of us scared," Rebecca continued. "We just let her do it." Michael folded his arms. "Well, not anymore." That night, a group chat started circulating. Someone created a private community group, a place where neighbors could share information and support each other, something they hadn't been able to do before because of Nancy. By the end of the day, nearly every house on the block had joined. Nancy had tried to divide them, but in the end, she had brought them together. While the neighborhood was thrilled to be rid of Nancy, there was another group scrambling to control the damage. The HOA board called for an emergency meeting the very next day, and Michael got a personal invitation. He almost didn't go. He had no interest in listening to corporate suits try to save face. But curiosity got the better of him. When he walked into the meeting room, he was shocked to find it packed. More than 50 people had shown up, far more than the HOA had expected. At the front of the room, HOA President Richard Lawson, a man in his late 50s with graying hair, cleared his throat. "We want to begin by addressing the recent events regarding Miss Nancy Thompson," he said. A wave of muttering swept through the room. "We had no idea that she was misrepresenting herself as a board member. She acted entirely on her own, and we want to make it clear that the HOA never authorized any of her actions." Michael leaned back in his chair, watching the board members squirm. They were desperate to distance themselves from Nancy, but it wasn't that simple. Rebecca stood up. "So, you're telling me that for years, she's been handing out fake violations, harassing homeowners, abusing your authority, and not one of you thought to do something about it?" Richard stiffened. Another voice cut in, Tom, Michael's next-door neighbor. "Where do you think she was getting your official letterhead, your exact fonts, and formatting? The HOA may not have officially given her power, but you let her run the neighborhood like a dictator." The room erupted in agreement. Michael let them argue for a while before finally speaking up. "I don't think anyone here expects you to fix what's already happened," he said. "But what we do expect is that this never happens again." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "We understand and we're making changes. Effective immediately, We're implementing new transparency policies. No HOA fines will be issued unless they come directly from an elected board member with an assigned statement. Any resident can challenge a fine at a public meeting. Michael raised an eyebrow. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Another board member, a woman named Linda, hesitated before speaking. We also want to offer a formal apology, Mr. Carter, and to everyone who was unfairly targeted by Miss Thompson. We're going to void all fraudulent fines and refund any money that was paid under false pretenses. The room fell silent. Then slowly, people started clapping. Nancy had spent years weaponizing the HOA. Now, for the first time, the HOA was actually listening. A week later, Michael was working on his Chevelle when a delivery truck pulled up to his driveway. A man stepped out holding a large envelope. "Michael Carter?" he asked. Michael wiped the grease off his hands and took the package. "Yeah." The man nodded, handed it over, and left. Frowning, Michael tore it open. Inside was a check for $10,000. His eyes widened. Attached was a letter from the HOA. With Nancy's iron grip loosened, the neighborhood began to shift in undeniable yet uneasy ways. Long oppressed residents began to relax, their fear of unpredictable fines gradually replaced by a cautious burst of creative expression. Lawns that once adhered strictly to strict and bland HOA standards now blossomed with colorful garden gnomes and bright, audacious flowers, accents that Nancy had once condemned as gaudy. In one particularly bold gesture of retribution and rebellion, someone even erected an army of pink flamingos as a cheeky nod to Nancy's downfall. For the first time in years, the community came together for a block party, a celebration laced with both relief and lingering resentment. Michael, typically a solitary figure, had no desire to join the festivities. Yet when Tom knocked on his door, cheerful and bearing a six-pack, Michael felt both compelled and conflicted. Inside the party, real smiles emerged among neighbors, genuine expressions of relief that were tainted by the scars of past oppression. Nancy's manipulations had intended to fracture the community, but her downfall had inadvertently stitched it back together, even as Michael wrestled with the irony of finding unity in the aftermath of betrayal. A month after Nancy's sentencing, an unexpected letter arrived, not from the HOA or the police, but from Nancy herself. Michael stared at the envelope, a swirling mix of indignation and an inexplicable pity building inside him. With hesitance, he opened it to find a single sheet scrawled in vehement, angry handwriting. "I hope you're happy. You ruined everything I built. That neighborhood. I made it what it is. You're a nobody. You'll always be a nobody. Enjoy your victory. It won't last." Michael exhaled slowly, a part of him empathizing with the twisted pride in her words, while another part recoiled at her refusal to accept reality. Even behind bars, Nancy clung to her facade of victimhood, unable to face the truth that she had never possessed true power, only an unsettling loudness that no one was willing to hear anymore. With a heavy heart, Michael crumpled the letter, tossed it in the trash, and walked away, the bitterness of the moment mingling with a reluctant sense of triumph. Later that evening, Michael sat in the driver's seat of his Chevelle, the familiar rumble of the engine pulling him back to a time before Nancy's reign of fear. As he drove down the street, windows down, the cool night air carried both the promise of newfound freedom and echoes of past turmoil. Passing Tom's house, he saw his neighbor raising a beer in a salute that felt both celebratory and sorrowful. Michael managed a conflicted grin and honked twice before speeding off into the open road. For the first time in months, threats and invasive fines had been replaced by an uneasy sort of liberation, one marked by both relief and the haunting weight of what had occurred. As the city lights twinkled in the distance, Michael pressed down on the gas, his Chevelle's roar mingling with the inner tumult of a man who had won, yet felt irrevocably altered. Nancy may have tried to take everything from him, but her fall had left him with a bittersweet, complicated victory, one that was as liberating as it was laden with the scars of conflict.